I'm the faculty of the Journalism School, and I'm the director of the UNC Center for Media Law and Policy. And Shri is kind enough to allow us to invite a law speaker occasionally to the colloquium. And we're very happy today to have Ann Klinefelter with us. Ann came to UNC in 1999 as the Assistant Director for Public Services in the Law Library and as a clinical assistant professor of law. In 2007, she became Director of the Law Library and Associate Professor of Law. Before she was at UNC, she worked in the law libraries at the University of Miami, at Boston University, and the University of Alabama. Oh, go Tide. I forgot, she always says that. I had that written in here. Rhonda says, go Tide.
Roll Tide, not
Oh, Roll Tide. Okay. Ann has a bachelor's degree with majors in English and Spanish and a master's in library science and a JD from the University of Alabama, Roll Tide. She teaches a privacy law seminar and has taught advanced legal research and introduction to American law for foreign exchange students at the law school. Her research interests focus on the intersection of library management and law, especially the areas of First Amendment, privacy, copyright, and licensing. She is active in many law library professional associations. She is on the advisory board for the UNC Center for Media Law and Policy. She has, over the years, served on several of our PhD student committees and is a favorite committee member. One of my students once described her to me as the sweetie pie of the world. I thought that was me, but I'm not, so Ann is.
It's not just one pie, there's plenty of room for us.
Plenty of room for that? Okay, more sweetie pie. So she's been a great friend to the journalism school, both through her activities in the law school library and working with our PhD committees. And the title of her presentation today is right up here. And this is Ann Klinefelter.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. I see some familiar faces and some new ones as well. This is a topic that I came to because I was trying to do some research about what are the best arguments for a constitutional right to read privately. And the First Amendment was the strongest place for that. And so I started digging more to see what kind of protection there is in libraries in particular, and found that it is really a mess. So I'm sharing that mess with you today and some ways of looking at it and some ideas. Maybe you'll have some suggestions too about how this whole area should be shaped. Okay, let's see, I've got this special clicker. So what we're going to do, I'm going to start by talking to you about sample library First Amendment issues, and then explain a bit about how it is that we have these inconsistent judicial approaches, but that have a trend towards deference, judicial deference to the libraries. Then we're going to look at why it is that courts defer to libraries, and then also look at some of the scholarship about theories of deference, how deference should be shaped according to certain proposals. And then we're going to talk about the effects of judicial deference on library behavior, and then whether that behavior, how that impacts the First Amendment. Then, as you can tell, we're going to explore some options beyond deference. Okay. First Amendment. Now, I expect people in this room to be very familiar with the First Amendment, despite the fact that surveys show that the general populace is not so aware of the protections that are in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. There's quite a lot in there, interrelated. First Amendment spoken of as its separate pieces and also as a collective unit. And libraries intersect with a number of these, but particularly speech and the press, and sometimes also for the right to petition and assembly, and occasionally religion is raised as well. The facts that are usually at issue. Classic example, removal of books from the library collection. or relocation of those books to some restricted area. This is, you've heard a lot about the book banning in libraries. This is a major traditional area of friction in public libraries. There's the filtering of the internet. This is done to protect children, and it also raises issues when libraries refuse to disable filters for adults. There are also claims of sexual harassment by library staff members when they are exposed to graphic sexual images on library users' computers. So those kinds of claims are also tied up in First Amendment issues, like sexual harassment, hostile work environment more generally. Also, regulation of user behavior, all types of things. Libraries have policies about grooming, wearing shoes, being quiet, no staring, no skateboards, But there's also issues tied up in this that relate to privacy directly. Surveillance would be one of the ones that you may have heard about from librarians in recent years. Who sues whom? This is confusing to a lot of people because generally you think of the scenario as books were removed from the library, someone in the community sues to have the books put back, and they'll sue the public library board of trustees. And we are generally talking about public libraries here. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And the First Amendment, though, in some of these cases can be, at that point it would be the defense. But sometimes there may be a challenge because, well, that would be the petitioner's claim that the First Amendment was breached when a book was removed. But the First Amendment can be a defense too. You may be familiar with the Children's Internet Protection Act. That was the most recent subject of library First Amendment law that got to the Supreme Court. And in that case, the libraries, library associations, and some website publishers sued to claim that this statute was violating the First Amendment. So in that case, the library was the plaintiff and not the defendant. Okay, I don't know if you can see this very well. This is a book that was in the news the last few days. It's a comic book from the 1930s, a Belgian author, and it has some racially insensitive caricatures. It's a comic book set in the Congo, and the Brooklyn Public Library has now restricted it to this room that you see in the picture on the right, and you have to make a request to get access to it. So you can see, one of the things that this shows is that fear of speech is an equal opportunity political kind of feeling. The issues of hate speech or to things that may be considered more of a conservative approach. We don't want our children to see explicit kind of materials, or we don't want any homosexual sex guides in the adult section of the library. This thing goes all around to we don't want things that have, well, it was Huck Finn has the word nigger in there. And so that's been challenged a great deal. So anyway, this is an example. Books, I wanted to show you a few things about challenges. These are challenges that are reported. There's estimated to be at least twice this that are not reported. But you can see public library challenges are about 25% of those that have been reported to the American Library Association. And I don't know if you can read that, the different types. School library, 35%. Challenges about school textbooks, 33%. So we're just talking about today the public library. All right, and it's tough to see this, but beautiful colors, I'm sure maybe you can see. These are the people who make the challenges, and for the most part, it's parents. So you can assume that those are probably school libraries, and that's where most of these challenges take place. But also library patrons, 13%, others, 10%, an administrator in the library system, 9%, a board member of a library board would be 3%, teachers 3%, pressure group 3%, and it goes on down to smaller categories. All right, another beautiful array of colors. These are the reasons why books are challenged. Offensive language, 19%. Sexually explicit, 23%. That's why sex is in the title of this talk. That's generally what's challenged. Unsuitable to age group, 16%. A number of children's books have been removed from children's sections of libraries and public libraries and relocated to the adult section under the theory that parents should select these and decide whether their children could see them, and the best way for them to do that is to have it in the adult section. Homosexuality, 6%, religious viewpoint, 5%, nudity, 4%, racism, 3%, sex education, 3%. You get some of the idea of the themes that are involved here. These are the number of challenges that have been reported. This is an aggregate, and most of these are going to be school library challenges, although there are some still in public libraries. You can see that we had a high point in 93 and 94. Who knows? I don't know what was being published then, maybe, or who knows. But it stayed pretty even. Now this is just a picture from a report that this particular library, Oro Valley in Arizona, has voted. Their town council and school board have voted to filter all the computers in the library, all the internet access, and that they will disable it on a case-by-case basis when adults make a claim that they think is valid. So that's the kind of thing that is also raising First Amendment issues. And then the surveillance issue. It's a cartoon, and this is about surveillance that had to do with terrorism, fighting terrorism after 9/11. I'm sure you heard about that. And then there's commercial collection of data. You may be doing research in a library using the computer, and in some ways, when you log into accounts, libraries are trying to educate users about that there are privacy issues, and these may be related to what could grow into some recognition of First Amendment rights for private reading and protection of your personal data. Okay, and this is just an example of a library policy that has to do with dress and personal hygiene. And these types of things have been challenged in court and upheld. Patrons shall be fully clothed, including footwear. Patrons shall maintain a generally acceptable standard of personal hygiene. Unpleasant body odor, which may offend other library patrons or staff, is considered unacceptable. And this happens. So then those people lose their rights to access to materials in the library. Okay, so why would the First Amendment apply at all? The First Amendment applies not just to Congress, but to state actors beyond the federal level. Public libraries almost always are considered state actors because they're publicly funded. We're just talking about publicly funded libraries to make this a simpler analysis. Beyond this test, all kinds of things happen. So that's what we're going to look at. It's a problem area. The courts apply the law in widely differing areas, but this trend toward judicial deference to libraries is based on a lot of different types of reasons. Some of them are very practical reasons, and some are principled. The inconsistency in the trend, though, has not created a sense of stability in the law. No guidelines for libraries or library users, and it actually leads to more challenges. Inconsistent application of the doctrine, at its root, it stems from a confusion and disagreement about what is the mission of public libraries. Okay, so on the one hand, if a public library encourages a diversity of private viewpoints indiscriminately, the court's going to look at public forum analysis, and many of you are probably familiar with what public forum analysis means. You're going to see what kind of rights users have on that government-owned property. And if it is, as has been determined a number of times by courts, considered a limited public forum for the purpose of access to information, then the court may apply strict or heightened scrutiny. there's still some confusion in the courts even about what's the proper level of scrutiny once you determine it's a limited public forum. But probably if it's about the purpose for which it is the right to receive, and there's any restrictions on receiving that information, the court would apply strict scrutiny. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And then, however, if what the library is doing, and this is at the core of what is its mission, if it's doing is encouraging a diversity of private views but narrows that diversity through a judgment of quality, then they're just going to look for some kind of egregious, invidious viewpoint discrimination. So you can see that's a pretty low standard of review. And we'll see what the outcome is of that. But this is all based on what is it that the library is supposed to do. And you've probably been familiar. Think of the fairly old-fashioned view of the library. You go there to get things that are selected for you. It's a prescriptive reading list that this is what's good for you, and we will tell you what it is. We have mission statements and 1930s textbooks for librarians that are about enrichment and uplift of the community, and this is more in keeping with that view. Okay, if we have a limited public forum, that's usually considered, it's a forum limited to certain groups and/or for certain First Amendment purposes. The restriction of the speech, as we were just talking about, within the limited purpose of the forum is subject to strict scrutiny, maybe, and must be narrowly tailored to serve a compelling government interest. So that's a standard you all be familiar with, I think. The speech outside the designated purpose must not discriminate against speech. The restriction outside of the designated purpose must not discriminate against speech on the basis of viewpoint and must be reasonable in light of the purpose served by the forum. Okay, so I just wanted to take a moment and make sure you understand why I'm just talking about public libraries, not public school libraries, because the mission of public school libraries, arguably, I'm not going to say this is correct, but arguably the public school library would have a greater claim to deference, because courts have often decided that they would recognize schools as having an inculcative role, meaning that prescriptive nature that I was talking about is the sort of old-fashioned view of public libraries, that we are going to discriminate against views, and that's the purpose. Okay. So you can see Rehnquist dissenting in this case from 1982, the Pico case, and he articulates it fairly well. It says, unlike university or public libraries, elementary and secondary school libraries are not designed for freewheeling inquiry. Public school libraries, though, elementary and secondary schools are inculcative in nature, and they're a place for selective conveyance of ideas. Okay. So who gets to decide what is the mission of the public library? That's really at the core of what the law is based on. So we've got people with different investments and different interests. You've got library boards of trustees who really have the authority to set policy and ultimate decision maker for public libraries. These are people from the community. Sometimes they're appointed, sometimes they're elected. Then you have the local communities who respond, who interact with the boards of trustees, who put them there, basically. You have state legislatures, because those folks also are now funding, in some ways, libraries or passing laws outlining what libraries may or may not do. Congress, as we talked about the Children's Internet Protection Act, they're in that business too. They've been also trying to equalize access to the internet through provision of some discounts to libraries that were too poor to do that on their own. So Congress has been involved in that way. And then library associations, you bet they have an interest in this. Library associations have a great deal of energy to put towards this. They've done a lot of thinking about it, writing, talking, developing standards, responding to new trends. This is where they live. And I can tell you, librarians who make up the library associations, very engaged in their associations. It's an extremely collaborative group, starting from the idea that why should hundreds, maybe thousands of libraries all catalog the same book on the same day? No. we copy. We get someone, usually the Library of Congress does, then we copy. So we collaborate. It's a great tradition in libraries, so very organized. But as you can see, the courts are the ones who finally, when they are challenged in this way, when libraries are challenged this way, they come to the courts has to decide, well, what standard of review are we going to apply? We'll look and see what the mission is. So that's what ultimately happens, is the courts are deciding what the mission is. So you can see now the American Library Association has this Bill of Rights, and you'll see in a lot of libraries that they've incorporated reference to this Bill of Rights, which has some protection. It talks a lot about access to a wide range of ideas. Nothing should be excluded, on discrimination based on viewpoint, basically. And then, let's see, they specifically say libraries should challenge censorship, an aggressive standpoint, not just don't indulge in it, challenge it. So you can see that there's a good bit of history in the library profession, and this has developed over the years as a sort of banner for librarians. Okay, so what happens in the courts? I'm going to talk to you just a sampling of some of the opinions that have come down. The Kramer decision in 1992, this is the Third Circuit, this came out of New Jersey. This court was looking at the problem of a homeless person who was driving people out of the library. And so, but there was a challenge based on his ejection, and it upheld the ejection, but at the same time, it was applying a strict scrutiny. It's talking about a positive right of public access to information and ideas includes the right to some level of access to a public library, which is the quintessential locus of the receipt of information. So this is a big, strong opinion at the Court of Appeals, right below the Supreme Court, talking about the library being, the public library is a limited public forum for receipt of information. Reading, writing, and quiet contemplation. But I can tell you even that, a little bit circumscribed. Talk about that in a minute. Okay, and here's another one. This was a district court case, Mainstream Loudoun Board of Trustees and Loudoun County Library in 1998 out of Virginia. And this predates the challenge to the Children's Internet Protection Act. And the staff was very upset. This is about having all these images that they were exposed to all the time. And sometimes the libraries had set up printing from computers so that the librarians had to deliver the printouts. And there were no privacy screens. And it was something of a right not to receive that was being asserted. And so the library had instituted these internet filters that they were not disabling. And the court found that that violated the First Amendment, that the library was a limited public forum for the right to receive, requiring strict scrutiny, and held that the filters were a prior restraint on speech. So then, at the Supreme Court, there are actually 3 Supreme Court cases that deal with libraries and the First Amendment. And every one of those, all 3 of those opinions are plurality opinions that don't even have a cohesive plurality. They're all fractured opinions, and they provide shaky precedent and a narrow holdings that courts, the lower courts can look to. So PICO, though, was about a school board. There was a group of parents that found that there were some books that were considered filthy, un-American, un-Christian, anti-Semitic, and some of them are Go Ask Alice, Slaughterhouse-Five, Best Short Stories by Negro Writers. So they wanted these removed from the school library. Now this is a school library case, but since the school library arguably merits more deference than a public library, you can certainly look to this case as the outer reaches of at the time at any rate, the Supreme Court was going to offer deference to even public libraries. And the prevailing opinion found a right to receive information. This is relevant to journalists as well as libraries and publishers. And they said that discretion, deference language, discretion may not be exercised in a narrowly partisan or political manner. The school library is the principal locus of freedom to inquire, to study, and to evaluate, to gain new maturity and understanding. Now, they weren't into form analysis at this point, and this case was came to the Supreme Court without a huge record, so they were remanding it to the trial court for full evaluation to see what was the motivation of the removal of the books. And it's a tough decision, because there was language about, well, if it was educational suitability, that's okay. If it was, partisan or political, that's not. And as you can imagine, sometimes these terms are very difficult to apply. What happened in this case was that they settled. The school board finally agreed they were going to put the books back with little slips or notices that had to go to parents, and then the ACLU who challenged said, nope, not going to settle for that. And so they finally put the books back without any kind of restrictions on their access. By that time, it was like 7 years since challenge. Students who were involved probably are all gone. New bad books were on the shelves. Who knows? But it was a major conflict in the community. In 2003 is the final of these three decisions. I'll jump back for a moment. I didn't give you a slide about this because it's a complicated early opinion, but 1966, Brown versus Louisiana in Clinton, Louisiana, there was a sit-in. A group of 5 young black men came into the whites-only, not by explicit policy, branch library in Clinton, and had requested a book, and the librarian said, well, I'll have that sent to you. We don't have it. You can get it from the For Negroes Only bookmobile, or we can mail it to you. He selected the mail, and then he sat down in the one chair in the small place, and his friend stood beside him. And after a few minutes, the librarian asked if did they need anything else, and they didn't. She asked them to leave. They didn't. It was a planned sit-in, and so the police were notified ahead of time. They showed up. They arrested them for breach of the peace. And as Mr. Brown is leaving, he says, what about the First Amendment? And the librarian says, well, we have it over here. And so anyway, the court did struggle with the idea of deference and whether this was, they didn't use public forum analysis explicitly, but whether it was a place that was suitable for a sit-in, and they found that there was a right to silent speech, and there was an impassioned dissent by Justice Black about how could we be telling them how to behave on the local level. They have their own regulations, and who knows, we weren't there, we don't know how this actually played out. But the court did overturn the convictions of these young men for breach of the peace, and did implicitly say that the library has to be open. It was an equal protection claim as well. And the library closed for at least 2 years. The library just closed. So one of the backdrops to all of this deference is the civil rights era, when what happened was communities, rather than the majority in communities, rather than accept minority opinions or access, they just started equalizing things by closing them down. Libraries, swimming pools. And so there's been a huge and scholarly trend since that time to try to figure out what is the role of courts. Should courts be messing with these deep, value-laden constitutional questions, or should this be something that happens more gradually through a democratic process? So then back up to then we had PICO, And then we have in 82, and then in 2003, the Supreme Court, plurality again, says that the library's traditional mission, the worthy traditional mission, makes form analysis inapplicable, and so they apply deference. The Children's Internet Protection Act was challenged as a facial challenge, which is distinct from an as-applied challenge, which would have been the rights of a library user to gain access. And they had libraries, library associations, and web publishers. And they said, well, we don't think this is a valid First Amendment claim because the Attorney General, the Solicitor General here in oral argument has assured us that the government won't have any trouble despite the permissive language of the statute. They say you must always disable this filter upon request by an adult. And so that became part of what this decision says. The problem with filters is, well, aside from the fact that they filter, is that they over-filter and under-filter because they're just, you know, they're programs, and there are nuances to speech and images. It's very difficult. You've all got spam filters, right? How well's that working? I mean, that's kind of what this is like. So the plurality conditioned the constitutionality on libraries' willingness to disable filters upon request by adults. So why did this court choose deference? They made analogies to two other cases, and one was the public broadcasting out of Arkansas, Forbes case. And they said that it was all right for them to make some editorial restrictions on, I think that was a debate for office, and they limited it to a couple of candidates rather than the full array. And then in Finley, that was the NEA had instituted some, Congress had passed that they needed to think about decency and diversity of viewpoint before they awarded grants to artists. There was the, you know, Mapplethorpe predated that. There were grants to some suggestive art and offensive, so to some people. So the court had employed deference in those situations, and it said, well, first of all, in Forbes, well, the people there who are employed by the government really are acting like journalists, and we have to give them freedom to use their judgment. They're more aligned with their professional association than with the government. And then in Finley, what they said was, well, it's just, you couldn't have awards for quality or excellence unless you were having some kind of content discrimination. So as long as there's not some kind of, you know, the invidious viewpoint discrimination, that's okay. And so they said libraries, implicitly hearkening back to that quality filter of libraries selecting things that are good for you, that's what libraries do. So the libraries, however, had been arguing, well, that may be. We have lots of reasons why we may select things for you and not just give you full access. Number one, we can't. The scarcity of resources, that's the major reason for this. It's a practical limitation. But then the internet came, and I think of this as similar to the idea of practical obscurity in the privacy context. Used to be, yeah, all of your property records and were down at the courthouse in these big books. Somebody had to go down there during the right hours to that particular county courthouse, pull the right books, track through. Now it's all on the web. All kinds of things are on the web that we didn't think, this sort of like the, nobody realized they needed to be private, sort of a fig leaf kind of illusion, but this happens too when all of a sudden the courts are confronted with the idea that, wait a minute, there might not be a scarcity argument, not the same kind of scarcity argument with the internet. It's all there. You pay for a subscription and you get the whole thing. You don't get a discount once you start filtering things out. So you can't make the same sort of scarcity argument. At least that's what the libraries put forward. But deference is usually about, it's most of the cases, aside from ALA, almost all the cases involving libraries and deference are school libraries, where there's that extra reason, at least the inculcative. And then there's a protective sense of what's harmful to minors that sort of distinguishes the school library cases. We talked about practical concessions, scarcity of resources, also evidentiary concerns. How in the world, when you have every day libraries across the country are always making decisions, I'll buy this, I won't buy that, I'll buy this, I won't buy that, I'll buy this. How in the world are they going to track how they made those decisions? So now they made a distinction in PICO. They were talking about, well, when you remove books, we have more of a record, and we can look at that, and we may be able to see what was the reason that it was removed, but not selection. Some other things that courts have expressed some concern about, why they tend to defer, the caseload management is getting to that particular issue. Also, as the ALA court shows, they really like that traditional mission of libraries. In fact, they've said, you know, well, the internet is nothing more than an extension of the book stacks, which is, as one of my law professors would say, that's a conclusion. So there's no reason it had to be, but apparently it was. I will add, though, we're going to see that there are ongoing scarcity issues, and we'll talk about how that plays into the internet. There's also a problem of the extension of a First Amendment from a negative right to a positive right, and this plays out very interestingly in libraries. It says that Congress, and by extension all government actors, may not abridge freedom of speech in the press. That means you may not stand in and interfere and prevent access, right? Well, that doesn't mean that there's a positive right on the part of the government to provide access. And so that's a problem when you get into talking about the library as a public forum, even as a limited public forum, because then there's this sense of a positive right. Well, I want that book, you better get it. And so that raises all kinds of potential problems. There's also, one of the reasons is this deference to local authority. That was present in Stevens' dissent in the ALA case, very much talked about why is there this one congressional national standard for how to solve the problem. There are other ways. Let people in their own facility make these choices. There are lots of ways to protect children besides limiting access to all, through all computers in a library. Okay. So the scholarship. Now you have scholars coming in and going, well, you know, courts are doing all this deference stuff, but it's just ad hoc. It's hit and miss, doesn't have a good theoretical. They need us to provide that principled doctrine. So we have some good, very interesting, thoughtful, and well-developed literature on this. One of them, which I found very intriguing, was the First Amendment institution idea. And this is an idea that grows out of an economics theory about the role of institutions and how we should recognize it through the law, even through constitutional law. And Frederick Schauer, who's one of the leading proponents of this idea, talks about how the court should start treating institutions differently. If you're an institution that tends to advance the goals of the First Amendment, we should give you a little free rein, because if you are working on reaching your mission, then we shouldn't interfere. Now, if you're an institution that tends to interfere, we're going to apply a stricter level of scrutiny. So the question becomes then, it begs the question of what are the goals of the First Amendment and what is the mission of the library? Sort of still have that problem. But Frederick Schauer would talk about how librarians' reason for being is the First Amendment. And that is often what librarians would tell you, you know, that's what we're here for. And they talk about how the same way we talked about with Forbes, that those journalists were more identifying as journalists rather than government employees, same with public librarians. Okay. So all of these, the people who write about First Amendment institutionalism, libraries are always in their top 5. Oh, and libraries. Universities, libraries, some write about journalism. And they don't seem to mind, even that if libraries are pursuing their traditional mission of serving you what we think you need, not what you may want. They're okay with that because that just contributes still in a positive way to robust discourse. In fact, they'd probably be okay because they think that we're doing this right, that it does help. It's the quality of discourse we're contributing to. They make that argument for universities too. So there's little doctrinal basis for this, but in the ALA plurality opinion, you can see that it's sort of there in that worthy traditional mission language. Another one is this, Robert Post has written about the First Amendment is all about, it should be about democracy. Political speech favored above all other types. This is the idea that it's democracy enhancing, meaning really what we should do is we should stay out, courts should stay out, and let the community communicate with the managers of these government institutions. It's called managerial prerogative, and it's in contrast with the government as sovereign, which means they're passing laws that have general applicability. There's some language in PICO about government as educator versus government as sovereign, and it is related to deference to local authorities, but there's still not a huge sense that this is reflected in the court's work. Okay, and this, of course, my favorite one. This is scholarship that would have us recognize librarians' expertise in managing the libraries, their collections, and policies. The theory is that courts should not second guess the decisions of librarians who are experts in managing all of these issues, both as a collective, like a national kind of professionalism principle, but also it relates to that local control too. Rodney Smalla is one of the scholars who advocates this. There are a number of others too, and they're not all law librarians or librarians. There's not much basis in library jurisprudence, but it may relate to that willingness to review removal of materials from a library collection, because a librarian put it there. So it's likely that someone other than the librarian is behind the removal, and that's true from the facts of most of those kinds of cases. There are some other areas in the law where there's recognition of expertise and deference based on that. Okay, so to go through, there are, you can see we've gone from 7% to 55% based on surveys of libraries that filter all the computers in their public libraries. 55% reflects actually those that receive those E-rate federal discounts that the Children's Internet Protection Act is tied to. So it may even be higher. A little more daunting is the fact that if Congress can do it, why not states? States are passing some laws too, saying libraries have to do something. Some of them are more permissive than the federal law and allow options. They almost all say you have to have some kind of policy, some sort of procedure for protecting children from graphic sexual images. And the National Conference of State Legislatures is tracking that beautifully on the web. You can see a chart. Utah, Colorado, Minnesota seem to be putting together some laws that would actually require filtering and not even disabling. Municipalities, they're getting on the bandwagon too. That Oro Valley, we saw the picture at the beginning. Very active library, got lots of community interaction, and you know, the librarian was interviewed and said, well, we will do whatever you tell us we're supposed to do. That didn't always happen. Some librarians get fired, and those cases are documented as well. They don't have the right to decide. They're an employee. Phoenix, too. has passed a law this way. And then some just have a policy on their own. The library is deciding we're not going to disable. And there's a case right now pending, Bradburn against North Central Regional, it's not a very compelling name, library in Washington. And right now it's in federal district court, but on cert to the state Supreme Court to determine if Washington's greater protection for speech would be dispositive. And then they can avoid the federal question, and then we won't have a precedent for this as-applied challenge, which is what this is. Okay. The impact on library behavior. Well, there's some study about the filters, but there needs to be more. We don't know exactly what's being overblocked or underblocked. There is a good bit of study going on. Some librarians, some library science professors are doing surveys, and they're testing different types of software to see what does and doesn't work. There are 2 open source systems that have been developed out of library communities, so you can at least, so that the librarians can see how does this work and how can we fix it. And so librarians are also doing a lot of testing and posting those results, so they share with each other. You can see that scarcity is still an issue. So that hope that technology and the full range of access on the internet would resolve a scarcity argument is really sort of illusory, because the problem is there are not enough computers, there's not enough wireless bandwidth for all the need, for all the demand of access. So what libraries are doing is they're imposing time limits, and they're also filtering does actually prioritize the type of material that is accessed through the internet in libraries. So we're back to a sort of layering, a prescriptive type of access to information. However, in this past year, the last survey that was 2007-2008, it's done out of the Library School of Florida. 44.4% of public libraries did not apply for federal E-rate discounts, and 31.6% cited the Children's Internet Protection Act requirements as the reason that they didn't apply. 38%, even more, said, well, it's just not worth all the bother to go through the application. All right, so how does this affect the First Amendment? Some of the goals that have been discussed at great length in the literature and in judicial opinions are the reasons for the First Amendment: the emergence of truth from the marketplace of ideas, support for a deliberative democracy, self-expression, and even just straightforwardly from the language of the amendment itself, preventing government from interfering with speech and press and association, petition, religion, just cutting off that interference. So there's also part of the problem here is that what happened in SEPA was that there was a sense that they could defer to libraries, and if they deferred to libraries, and libraries could on their own filter the internet, then Congress's spending power, they could decide what to fund and what not to. They were not inducing libraries to violate the First Amendment, but there's still a lot of debate about that sort of approach. Okay, the impact, continuing. The problem is that there is probably filtering more things than are intended, and the court has invited as applied challenges, which this Bradburn case could be. So part of the problem is that if libraries really want to evolve in some way to follow these aspirational goals, at least, of no censorship, robust access, we've got healthy interlibrary loan systems. If you don't own something, you can still get access. So we would act as more of a library system than just individual libraries. it's sort of stalled if that's the way the courts are going to look at what the library's mission is. And the reason is, if the court's not there to back up a library to do these things, they are simply at the mercy of the political process that is the Library Board of Trustees. So, you know, and libraries are possibly going to evolve. They already are. You know, you go to a computer, you're not just receiving, you're contributing now. Everything's interactive. So it's a different type of place. Why the scholars' proposals fail, the public library's alignment with professional library norms is the requirement of this theory to work. And library trustees, they're not librarians. They're really in between the librarians and the community. So you can't really say that that's their mission. So really that's about community standards for access. And that's really not the same as having a First Amendment that's enforceable to protect unpopular speech. By definition, community standards are popular speech. And the managerial prerogative depends on acceptance of a political responsiveness as a democracy-enhancing goal, which is really the only or the predominant purpose of the First Amendment. And then the First Amendment, what's the point? It's just something that is advisory. You know, you should do this. So the professionalism principle, that one has difficulties. Librarianship is not as evolved or developed as some other professions. Although there are master's degrees, there's a national association, there's standards and best practices, there is no licensing and no real tradition of self-employment, some of the marks of the profession. And so I'm playing around with these things. What are some of the alternatives to deference? You can have deference with some limitations, and forum analysis, there's the possibility that individual libraries might say, hey, we are distinct. We are our own, we're the Santa Cruz Public Library, and we are about total public access to all information, and therefore the Children's Internet Protection Act does violate the First Amendment in our library because we are a limited public forum. That's our mission. We're all committed. We're all on board. That's one way of looking at it. Another is that you could say, in this trend towards giving government speech rights or institution speech rights, the library, for example, that same kind of Santa Cruz public library, that they have this right to challenge any interference. There are also ways to look at intermediate and heightened scrutiny and strict scrutiny that would look to national norms in a stronger way than the ALA court did, to see if there's a proper fit between the solutions to these compelling government interests that conflict with the First Amendment. And so I'll leave you with this. Those are the Dewey and LC call number ranges for the First Amendment. So let's hope that we can find a way to not just shelve it, but embody it in others. So I'd be interested in your thoughts, your reactions, and how you feel going into a public library, and whether you feel like you need access to everything, or you feel like you also have a right not to inadvertently be exposed to things that you would rather not see. Yes?
I'm interested in, where is the limit in library on sexually explicit material? I mean, is it based on the idea of pornography versus just indecency, or?
What a good question. We have meetings like this. I see colleagues or librarians here, and we actually, librarians struggle with this. At the national level, what they say is librarians are not any better situated than everyone else to decide, first of all, what's obscene and what's not. I mean, child pornography, pretty easy to figure out. And at that point, you call the police. But if it's, what's that borderline between pornography, which is legal for adults, it may be harmful to minors, because that's been determined to be illegal. Graphic sexual images could be illegal for children. We have meetings where we talk about, well, is it medical or is it pornographic? I mean, does it have a shine to it, or is it just clinical? How do you, it could be the same image. So that's one of the difficulties with this.
Is it then, in your argument talking about, you can have an individual library that's a different standard than
Absolutely.
state, so does it tend to be?
Absolutely, and that's where some are perfectly comfortable with the idea of community standards applied to non-obscene speech. That's what we've used for determining obscenity, so now it seems to be gaining some currency in these other gradations of less favored speech. Good questions. Yes?
I have a question about the professionalism of a librarian. What is that based on? Does it have to do with their ability to select materials, or would that be considered part of it?
That would be considered part of it. The idea that they have expertise in managing the whole picture, not just evaluating a subject. Because a lot of times what librarians do when they select materials is create the collection development policy, public librarians, with approval by the board, and then they would look at reviews. They may write some reviews. They look at each other's reviews. They also look at who the publisher is, who the author is. So you're not looking at the whole book and reading a book before you buy it. There are all these. Is that not? That's not what you mean?
No, I mean I have great respect for librarians. It just happens that at the AEGMC conference in Chicago a year ago, I just happened to attend because I was considering applying to PhD programs, so I decided to go see what it was all about, and I became fascinated with a PhD student's paper about selection of Newbery Award winners. Anyway, so I got so excited about this study that I actually did a story for it for Bloomberg News, where I worked for at the time. And what was very interesting about this study was that the last time a black author won the Newbery was 8 years ago. The last time a Hispanic author won the Newbery was 43 years ago. So that, there's a lot of complicated issues with that, which is how many books are published each year for children that are by black and Hispanic authors, etc. But it still seems to be a little, you could question the selectivity skills of librarians quite easily, and I guess I'm just not as comfortable as I was after having read the study.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are lots of there are criticism not just of, say, the Newbery Awards, but of perhaps the blandness of collections. And some would say that it's encouraged by this type of doctrine, that if a librarian wants to get the Mappa for books, or Madonna's Sex, which has been an example that's used in some of these discussions, they're really going to have to weigh whether they want to deal with all of the complaints that they're going to get, and ultimately they're expendable. So that does play into, sometimes their selection is not necessarily what they think ultimately should be there, but what they think serves the community, and perhaps that's a good thing. It's hard to say. Whether the profession is responsive to diversity in that context, clearly there are some issues. I don't know enough about that. But I think the professionalism is, courts defer to them even when we have approval plans. I don't know if you know what an approval plan is, but if you don't have enough staff to review all the books that may come across the desk, well, that's what you do. You say, we want, on all these subjects, which is a content-based decision, but not a viewpoint one, we want all these subjects to come to us, and they may select publishers. And then if you're really trying to be open, you would also say, I want these small publishers, not the major publishers, but small press. That was one of the things that I remember being taught a lot about when I was in library school. So it's a time management thing too. But the courts were just fine with that. In fact, that's what they said. Well, when you filter the internet, you just pick categories. That's what you're probably doing on some of your book selection initially. Other questions? Yes?
I have a couple of questions. I was surprised that you thought that deferring to the libraries and the librarians was a bad idea.
Me too. I really didn't expect to go there. Yeah, do you want me to respond to that?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was kind of hopeful when I started this that deference to libraries would be the thing, especially that they could be First Amendment institutions, then I could make an argument that they should have a speech right based in being First Amendment institutions, and then libraries could challenge any laws that interfered with robust access. That was where I was going. And then I realized librarians are not libraries. Librarians are employed by their communities in these libraries. And that most of the time what's going to happen is when there are librarians who've dug in their heels following the Library Bill of Rights that they will challenge censorship in all its forms, that they're fired. And so deference to libraries does not mean deference to librarians. It's distinct from the professionalism principle. It means you're deferring to the local community, deferring to political responsiveness, deferring to democracy and majoritarian processes, which to me is the opposite of a First Amendment that is a protection of minority interest against what some have said is the tyranny of the majority. So that's what research will do for you. Change your mind.
Shows you have an open mind. Do the courts recognize that the mission of a library can differ from library to library, even within the same type of library?
Well, I think that the yes and no. Most of the time, the challenges are an individual library, and then we'll look to other cases that talk about similar public libraries and then treat them as a category. Certainly in the Children's Internet Protection Act, they were treated categorically. And that was part of Stevens' dissent, which was that, let individual libraries determine this on their own. So I think that is a way that at least some libraries, but then really what you're getting to is community standards, because they're all based on community standards unless the court is willing to step in and say, if you're going to have a library, you have to do something broader. And then we still have scarcity issues. Yes?
A couple of questions, Dan. First, you had some national data. In your research, did you run across data or anecdotes about things happening here in North Carolina in terms of challenges or cases?
Yes, I did. There is a district court case in North Carolina about a man who was ejected from the public library system. I don't remember the site right now, but because as a librarian was walking by, he had what he described as uninvited pop-up windows of nude bodies. And so he was challenging his ejection because he had not had a right to appeal. So there was a due process protection involved. And so there's some sense that in North Carolina there is some kind of right, at least a due process in a library, that may be based on the right to receive. I don't remember whether there was form analysis applied in there, but that happens a lot more in the lower courts. There's still a good bit of jurisprudence that continues, despite ALA, to talk about libraries as a limited public forum.
Is that a state or federal?
That was a federal case, right.
My second question is, are there good studies on the demographics of public library users?
Yes.
How they may differ from the community at large, or how their demographics, when you talk about community standards, it seems to me what you're really talking about most of the time are the standards of people who use the library, which is something different.
That's such a good question, and that raises a couple of things that I think are interesting. One is libraries don't always want to survey the people who are already coming to the library, or just they want to increase the number of people who come. And it changes depending, like for example, I've been reading a lot about how public libraries are seeing their use go up during this bad economic time. People are coming to the library trying to get a lot of information through the internet, applying for jobs even, and that sort of thing. So some people come sometimes, some come at other times, and then there may be people in the community who actually really care what other people are looking at in the library. So that becomes, and sometimes it's not the community standard, it's the vocal minority in the community that can do it. So there are some surveys that talk about, it's difficult because libraries respect the privacy of the users. They don't require you to screen yourself when you come in and say, well, yeah, I make this much per year, or those kinds of things. So it's difficult to do. They talk about really just what the communities are, the demographics of the communities in which the library resides, rather than the demographics of the users. Occasionally there are surveys of people coming and going from the libraries, but they probably just reflect 1 week's visit. So it's a good question. Yes?
And it sounds like, yeah, I was very taken what you said too, of the decisions being made by boards, library boards, which often are very political creatures, just like school boards. So librarians need academic freedom.
Exactly.
Is that what it boils down to?
It does.
And has that argument come about in cases? You mentioned librarians being fired and such. Where does that go?
That is tied in with this professionalism principle, I think, that there should be some recognition and some protection, and I've thought about that. I don't know that, that's even a mixed bag at the academic level for librarians. Some librarians have tenure, some have long-term contracts, but they don't have as much academic freedom as the professors do in colleges and universities. Public library librarians are a long way from having that. They really have to negotiate that at every step. It's a major management, public relations type of job. So that would really change the culture. I don't know how much communities would want to do that. That would be a big shift, but that would make the difference. Then you really could look to those librarian standards, and I think it would be more of the reason that scholars advocate libraries being a First Amendment institution. It would be closer to their understanding to what they think libraries are like. Other questions?
Yeah, I was surprised by the number of libraries that had given up the E-rate discount.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Because I
pretty-
thought there were just filters on all the public library computers now.
Not
because of
Chapel
that.
Hill, not Durham.
How much, do you know how much money it is?
Yeah. Well, I
Is
don't
it like
have the
7
numbers.
cents and that's why they don't care?
That's part of it. Well, you saw the figure said, I think it was 30-something versus 36. 30-something said that they would not apply because of the E-rate, the SEPA requirements, and 36 said, yeah, and by the way, it's too much trouble. The paperwork is very difficult, and some of the reports showed that the amount of money that you would get, you would have to spend that plus some to purchase the software and manage it. So they think it's not been a great success in that regard. So
That's
it's
the good news.
It's well, yeah, it's a practical kind of principle.
Interesting.
Overlap.
Anybody else have a question? Thank you very much.
Thank you.